Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi and, well, let's face facts. They put out 10 new archetypes on average with every new set, and as budget players, we can't really build 10 new decks 4 or 5 times a year. But I do think you can build at least one. So today we are going to be putting together a draft archetype plan so that when you go into a draft, you can get the very most for your resources that you possibly can. This season, I'm hanging out with the friends here in Bloomburrow, and, well, I don't really look any different. Apparently, I'm always in beast mode. And if you want your Magic the Gathering experience on and off Arena to be in beast mode too, make sure to check out my Patreon page, because, let's be honest, not everything makes it to YouTube. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right. Alright, so as we begin this discussion, let's do so by getting a couple of big things out of the way for this set. This set is unlike a lot of the ones that we have seen recently. It is a high synergy set, which means that those lower rarity cards are meant to synergize across various themes depending upon the archetypes. The bottom line here is just drafting good cards is not going to cut it. Eventually, you are going to lose out to a deck of lesser cards that synergize and gel together better. So synergy is one of the things in these evaluations that we have to take very, very seriously. Up next, we need to take some clues from the color blue. And first off in that discussion, blue's commons are, well, kind of narrow, weak, not particularly deep compared to, well, every other color in this set's limited environment. Making it a pretty tough choice and probably not something that you want as one of your primary colors. However, blue's uncommons tend to synergize very, very well. And like we talked about, synergy is going to be one of the cores of this limited environment. With that in mind, blue is most often going to be a smaller secondary color, allowing the stronger primary color to take the lead and just highlight through those synergies. There are also cases where you're going to be running a 2-color deck and potentially splashing 4 very strong blue cards. That having been said, blue's removal is never really particularly good, so we're really talking about just a couple of bombs here. Now, outside of cards that might represent particular synergies for certain deck archetypes, there's only 2 rares that I think are really universally splashable. The first is Mockingbird, with its ability to basically clone at, well, a very good rate. And the second is Portent of Calamity, giving you some extensive pseudo card draw. And I believe the final thing that you really need to bear in mind as far as a broad stroke for the Bloomburrow set is the list. This was originally presented to us, Arena players, as a 300 card rotating list of mostly historic playable things that could be opened in play boosters and used in various limited environments. However, with Bloomburrow, the list is 10 cards, and it shows up in packs less than 2% of the time. The net result here being that there is less potential to value draft here just because there are going to be less rares and mythics being presented to you. And for that reason, I would not fault anyone that wanted to cut this season's limited drafting off a little bit early and maybe save some gold or resources for future endeavors. Because, hey, let's not forget, Foundations is going to be coming to Magic and Arena alike come November. And, well, those cards are going to be standard legal for a very long time. Before we get into the details of this particular set, it's important to understand the evaluation process that goes into these archetypes. Because we, particularly as budget players, need to make sure that we're maximizing all of that marginal utility to get the very most out of our bang for our buck, so to speak. Way more important than it is for players that are not as budget minded. So there are three main factors that I use to evaluate a limited archetype, and they're not presented here in any particular order. And in fact, depending upon your limited environment, these will shift in relative importance. But first, I'd like to talk about value, and that is a concept that we deal with a lot as free-to-play and budget players. Here, we are specifically talking about the ability of a limited archetype to convert itself into a constructed deck, because otherwise we've drafted a bunch of cards that we might never really play again. Next up, let's talk about the accessibility of a particular archetype. And within that, there's a couple of factors here, as you can see. The first consideration is the depth of the archetype. Is this supported by a wealth, a broad depth of low rarity commons and uncommons that really make that archetype work? Or is it very dependent on just very select higher rarity cards, making it a little harder to pull off? Very often within a limited format, we start hearing about the very best deck or the very worst deck, and that affects the way people draft. So one of the issues that we need to be considering is the relative popularity of a deck. Is this going to be highly disputed within your draft pod where 3 or maybe even 4 players are trying to move towards that and making the cards that much harder to get? Or is this an archetype that people maybe aren't really giving enough justice to, or possibly even actively avoiding, making it wide open for that one player at the table to really take advantage of? And lastly is the issue of flexibility of the archetype. If things don't go to plan, and we all know sometimes that happens more often than we'd like to admit, how easily can we flex or pivot into another archetype or style? How well do those color choices interact with other combinations so that we can make those clutch shifts when we need to? The missing component here, of course, is performance. How well a particular archetype will do within the limited environment against the other cards in that pool and the other competing archetypes. Or to put it in simpler terms, will it win? While value oftentimes takes the front seat for us as a budget community, and winning is less important, the reality is there is a component here for winning. If you are doing any sort of value draft or a token supported premium draft, really just one win makes drafting a better option than just buying packs. If you're outside of that value draft or token supported premium draft, really again you're looking at 2, maybe more like 2.5, depending upon where you are in the history of Arena, to make that endeavor more worthwhile than buying packs. So winning is an important component here and needs to be taken into account. In the end, all of these different factors and components come together, and I tend to sort the archetypes into 3 basic tiers. Of course, the top tier is the title of the video, Top 3 Archetypes. These are the ones that I feel like our budget community needs to be focused on for the various reasons that we have just covered. It is not necessarily the top 3 best performing archetypes overall. As we have explained, there are other factors that budget players need to be mindful of. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we have the tier 3, the decks that I recommend that you pretty actively avoid because the majority of the time it's just not going to be very beneficial for you. That having been said, of course, on any given day, any given limited event, the colors might come together for you. You might get access to really bomb-tastic cards, and anything could be playable on any given day. The middle ground is what I lovingly refer to as the backup plans, things that are not necessarily one extreme or the other, but often make good fallback points when your tier 1 plans don't come together. Maybe a color dries up, maybe you open a bomb in pack 2 and you need to shift a little bit. Those backup plans can be exactly what saves a draft for you, as opposed to being all in on the top tier aspects. Sometimes it's better to shift into a backup plan and have an overall better performance. All right, let's get started here with the actual tier list. We already talked about blue being a little bit of a weak link, so let's go ahead and get those specifically placed and talk about why. There we go. Nice. So the broad strokes for the blue archetypes, beyond the general weakness of the color blue in the limited format, is that the archetypes require more setup than their payoffs can really justify. For instance, the blue-white Birds deck wants you to have flyers and non-flyers in pretty equal quantities. The blue-green deck, of course, is all about bouncing things, and I think someone has the potential to break that for Constructed, but at the moment, I'm just not seeing it. The blue-white Birds deck certainly presents some cards that could very easily see play in a blue-white Skies or base blue Flyers deck in either Alchemy or Historic. But when it comes to Standard, I just think there's better things we can be doing. Now, for the Izzet Spells deck and the Dimir Threshold deck, those two hold a little bit more potential to synergize with cards outside of Bloomburrow for potential long-term Izzet Spells or Dimir Graveyard-based decks. So those were strong enough reasons to push them into a tier 2 position. And while we're talking about relatively weak archetypes, let's go ahead and finish out the bad category. That, of course, is the Squirrels deck or the Golgari deck. While I think this archetype does present individual cards that will find homes in various standard decks over the next 3 years, Squirrels and Forage at this point in time just has too far to go to really be considered a deck archetype of its own. Alright, so now let's switch gears and talk about those good choices, particularly for us budget players. In much the same way that the color blue presented kind of a weak position, white, on the other hand, presents a number of archetypes that are very strong and highly synergistic, supported by low rarity cards that support not only one, but often multiple archetypes within the color. All of the remaining white decks, the black-white bats, the red-white mice, and the green-white rabbits, not only present strong archetypes within the limited environment, but also show a very high potential for constructed viability as standalone decks. Although there is a possibility that mice is going to be more of a support for a mono-red base deck, but that remains to be seen. Needless to say, all of these are very strong candidates for adding to your collection as well as your limited win rates. There's very little doubt in my mind that we won't be the only group that notices just how powerful white's potential can be within the limited environment, and thus it is very likely to be highly disputed, particularly in draft. With that in mind, we need to make sure we have secure fallback positions on that tier 2. Next up, we've got the Red-Green Raccoons. This is another one of those that just lacks the internal synergy to really make a deck of its own. But let's face it, red-green is a pretty basic archetype year over year over year, set over set. So there is little doubt that these cards have the potential to find homes in budget red-green decks over the next 3 years. I would be very surprised if these cards did not find homes. On the flip side of that coin, the black-red lizard deck has already found a home. Individual cards from this, while they won't make probably an archetype all their own, they fit remarkably well into the existing Outlaws deck that we all have as a starter this year. Not only were many of the key cards in that deck lizards in their own right, but of course, the lizards from Bloomburrow are all about your opponent having taken damage, and well, that's a crime in and of itself, but in a good way. These also benefit from the lands that allow you to commit crimes, etc., etc. It's not going to be a deck all its own, but it already has a home. So there it is, guys. That is my perspective on the individual draft archetypes from our own budget perspective. Drop down in the comments, let me know which of these archetypes is your favorite and how much drafting do you plan to do this season. And before we go, of course, I always want to thank my entire Patreon community for supporting not just my passion, but the community at large. And in particular, this time around, I wanted to recognize Searing Blaze and Kenny F. They are coming up on their 1-year anniversary of support. Thank you all. Thank you guys. I could not do this without you. And of course, let me leave you with some suggestions for your next step here on the channel.